Good morning. This is Daniel with Cop Watch TV. Just wanted to thank everyone for joining us here on a Friday while we go over some of the police incidents and videos. And really, we're going to break down some of the most important issues in policing. And this week was a busy week. There was just so many incidents that happened when it comes to officer-involved shootings, new laws being enacted, a lot of interesting stories to go over. So while we're going through these stories, make sure that you comment. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and I'm going to get to as many questions as we can. I just want to remind everyone that we do this every Friday, so please subscribe to and hit the notification bell on Cop Watch TV. And if you want to follow me, I'm at Police Law News over at YouTube and TikTok. So where's everybody from today? If you could put that in the chat. We'd like to see where people are, to see if we have any local people who might have some inside knowledge on stories. Also, we do have a super chat going, so we will definitely get to your question or comment if you put that in there. So definitely think about doing that if you want your comment read. And we do have some red and blue lights that are going to flash behind us once we get a super chat. So again, welcome everybody in. And the first case that we're going to start to go over is it was at Love Field at Dallas Airport. So it isn't too often that there is a shooting at an airport, but it happened this week. And the woman's name, she's a 37-year-old. The woman's name, she's a 37-year-old woman named, I'm going to mess up her last name, but Porsha. So Portia's a 37-year-old woman, and what she did is she took a vehicle to the airport. She was dropped off. This is at Dallas Love Field. So she was dropped off, and once she got to the airport, she went into the bathroom and she changed clothes. When she came back out, she went to the ticket counter, the Southwest ticket counter, and she told the clerk there that she had an announcement to make, that she had something to say, and she was acting kind of strange. It was at that point that she pulled out a firearm and she started shooting in the air. And thankfully, there were armed police officers that were just about right there. And because of the non-Uvalde response from police officers who were there, they were able to stop this situation pretty quick. So almost immediately, police officers engaged Porsha, and they started giving her commands to drop the gun. And then one of the officers did fire their weapon. She was struck a couple different times. And the good thing is that, yes, she did return fire, and she did shoot at police officers. No civilians, no innocent people, and no police officers were injured. She was taken into custody, and she did survive her injuries. Now, let's talk about Porsha a little bit. So this is a situation where someone who has not only has a criminal history, but she also has a mental health history. From what we're learning, she doesn't have any kind of diagnosis that's at least been public. But in the past, she has made comments that she was married to singer Chris Brown, and also she had been prosecuted and accused of arson. During that police investigation, she told police officers that one of the reasons that she set the house on fire is because she was a messenger of God. So she also, in 2019, she was also charged and prosecuted for armed robbery. She went into a bank, and at gunpoint, she robbed a bank. Now, with that particular prosecution, she was found to be not competent. So what they made her do is they made her do some inpatient and some outpatient treatment, and then they let her back out into society. This was in 2019. Now, maybe it's a controversial thing to say, but if you commit a violent crime, and if they deem you competent enough to come back into society with the rest of us, then you're probably competent enough to stand trial. But that isn't what happened here. So let's break this down just a little bit further. This is a situation where at least it seems like the system worked. So she was accused of committing a couple crimes, more than this, but for sure the arson and the bank robbery. Police investigated, they charged her, and she was prosecuted. And it was at the prosecution level that it broke down because she was found to be incompetent and then not held in custody. She was essentially just released after a little bit of treatment. So because of this, she tried to buy, so not because of this, but she tried to buy a firearm, and this is from the Dallas police chief. He did an interview about this. She tried to buy a firearm a couple different times, and she was denied. So because of her criminal history, and she also had a warrant out of New Mexico, that she was actually not able to purchase a firearm. So this is another instance, another example of the system working in this case. Someone who's mentally ill, who had committed crimes, who has an active warrant, wasn't able to pass a background check to obtain a firearm. Despite that, she somehow got a firearm anyway. So I think we have to ask the question, when it comes to firearms laws and gun control, I think we have to ask the question, if people who are willing to violate our murder laws, are those the kinds of people who are going to follow the gun control laws? And the answer is probably no. So no, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have any laws when it comes to gun control, but we already have a lot of laws. We have felon in possession of a firearm laws, and most states have enhancements for sentences where individuals commit these crimes with a gun. So it's just something that I want people to think about. But in the chat, if you can put, if there's a law or a policy, or if there's something that the government could have done that would have prevented Porsha from obtaining a gun and going into the airport and shooting, put it in the comments. Because I think it's important to have this dialogue, and maybe there's some idea out there that a lot of us just aren't aware of. So if you have any ideas, do that. Someone commented, Jennifer commented, why were her gun rights not removed in 2019 with a mental health diagnosis? So good question. So it's not that her rights can be removed, but it's that she has to go through a background check to purchase a gun, and she didn't pass that background check. Multiple times she tried to purchase a gun, and she wasn't able to purchase a gun, but she was able to get one anyways. So again, my thinking on this, and please correct me if I'm wrong or if you have a different opinion, the people who are going to violate our murder laws aren't going to follow our gun control laws. It isn't like, oh, well, I'm not able to buy a gun at this store, so I'm just not going to go and shoot up the airport. Like, I don't think that's a thing. So please put in the chat. I Spy says you have a Second Amendment right and shall not be infringed. Yes, that is what the Second Amendment says. I am a Second Amendment advocate. But however, the Supreme Court does allow there to be some reasonable restrictions on Second Amendment. Whether if you have been convicted of a felony, if you've been found mentally defective, things like that. And Porsha actually fell into that group. So I think that is an interesting case to start with. It's a good thing that nobody was hurt or killed, and that Porsha was injured by the police officers, but she is going to survive and stand trial. And hopefully either she will be prosecuted or she will be institutionalized so she can no longer be a danger to the rest of us here in society. Let's see. So that is the first case. If we have any comments on that case that I haven't already read, I'd be more than happy to go through them or answer any questions. Let's see. Minority Reporter, Supreme Court doesn't trump the Bill of Rights or the Constitution. That's an interesting point, and on a philosophical level, yeah, I like that. I think that's correct. But in reality, the Supreme Court's job is to interpret the Constitution. So either, depending on how you feel about it, either fortunately or unfortunately, the Supreme Court does override things that are in the Constitution or interpret them in a way, laws in a way that they feel are within the Constitution, which does restrict some rights. Let's see. I Spy removed the Supreme Court judges for infringing on the rights. Well, Supreme Court justices are lifetime appointments, so that would be difficult to do. One more from Ray Baker. Misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence and 2 DUIs in Illinois will strip you of your gun rights. What do you think about that? So that must be a law in Illinois. Okay, so let's talk about the domestic violence. So one of the gun bills that just recently passed, that I went over a couple weeks ago, is it essentially says that if you are convicted of domestic violence, that one of the things that the law says is that if you're convicted of domestic violence, that's one of the ways that the government can take your guns away or to make it so you can't have a gun. So the thinking is that domestic violence and violence between partners is a real problem in society. So if someone is convicted of domestic violence, that we are not going to allow them to purchase guns anymore, just like people who are convicted of felonies, even if it's a misdemeanor domestic violence. So I think that might have some unintended consequences. So just one of those unintended consequences really quick is that if you have people who are actual victims of domestic violence and you have an abuser, it's reasonable that they might want to be safe from that person and to not want that person to have a gun. But again, does a piece of paper or does just because someone can't buy a gun at a store. Obviously, just with this case we're talking about today, that doesn't mean the person can't get a gun. There's no magic force field around the person that prohibits them from having a gun. But that would be the purpose behind that law. But I think it has an unintended consequence. So as you can imagine, a lot of times domestic violence is he said, she said, he said, he said. And a lot of times there isn't video, there isn't evidence. You can imagine police officers go into a situation and meet two people who they think are both perfectly nice or both perfectly not nice. They've never met. Police officers aren't psychics. They don't have a crystal ball. And if there isn't any evidence, and if it's one person's word against another person's word, and both individuals want someone charged with domestic violence, and then if that goes to a prosecution later, you can imagine a situation where it's like, if it's something like that would lead to someone losing their rights to own a firearm, that may not be a great thing. Also, if someone is an actual victim of domestic violence, where there isn't any question, there's clearly probable cause, this is one of those things where it's like a lot of times in domestic violence cases, in order to save the victim, the having to go through a trial and having to be re-traumatized again, they work out plea deals. Prosecutors work out plea deals where the offender has to go through, counseling or substance abuse counseling or mental health counseling, something to that effect. And maybe there's some jail time attached too. And this makes it so the victim doesn't have to be re-traumatized and sit through a trial. But you can imagine a situation where if also attached to that conviction is that the offender is going to lose their rights to ever own a firearm, you can see that an offender might not want to agree to that. So maybe this would cause more trials and more make it so that it would be more difficult for victims to get any kind of justice. So I think that so when you ask what my opinion is on that, I think that there are a lot of unintended consequences with that, and especially if it is a conviction for a misdemeanor. I know that passed. My guess is that once that bill is passed and it's in law, and if someone is affected by it, and if that ever gets to the Supreme Court, it'll be interesting to see if that is something that they will agree with there. All right, so Ray Bakes, it doesn't apply to police officers in Illinois, though. I guess that's sarcastic, and that's fine, because it would apply to police officers. When it comes to these things, police officers would be in the same category as anybody else. If a police officer commits a felony, they would have their rights to firearm be taken away just like anybody else. So the next case that I want to talk about, this happened in Houston. I know we had someone from Houston in here on July 8th of this year. The individual's name is Roderick Brooks. So this is an officer-involved shooting. And if you remember the Patrick Loyola case in Grand Rapids, Michigan with Officer Christopher Schur that happened a couple months ago, this case is pretty much the Texas version of the Patrick Loyola case, and here's why. So there was a call for service over at a Dollar General. Two people called in. A clerk called in and said that an individual had stolen detergent and some other things and then pushed her on the way out, and a citizen, just a regular civilian who was there with his son, he also saw it happen, and he called to police too. And he said a couple things on the 911 call that were really interesting. He described what happened, and he said that he's going to keep following the person. He said that, this guy pushed the clerk and battered her in front of me and my son. That isn't right. He needs to be taught a lesson. So essentially, this person stayed on the line with police officers, with dispatch, kept Mr. Brooks in his view, and guided police officers in. So a police officer responded to the scene, a couple blocks away. They were able to contact Mr. Brooks. Commands were given to Mr. Brooks. He didn't follow the commands, such as, get on the ground, show me your hands. Mr. Brooks didn't follow those commands. The police officer then took out a taser and tried to tase Mr. Brooks. As we've seen in a lot of cases recently, the taser was not effective. After the taser wasn't effective, the police officer went to an empty hand tactic. Essentially, he did a takedown. He kind of grabbed Mr. Brooks, and they both went down to the ground. Now, it's at this point that I know it's easy to Monday morning quarterback things, but it's important to say what the police officer did, and could the officer have done anything different? Because if we don't ask those questions, then we're basically saying that we're okay with this outcome, which we're not. Anytime someone is killed in an officer-involved shooting, that's not the outcome that the police officers want. It's not the outcome that the citizens want. So it's important to ask these tough questions, even if it makes the police officer not look great. So what happened is once they were on the ground, So once they were on the ground, the officer did something that, wasn't tactically sound. The officer set his taser on the ground, so he had both hands free and he was wrestling with Mr. Brooks. Once the taser was on the ground and not in his grasp, Mr. Brooks grabbed a hold of the taser. The sergeant, I think he was a sergeant, the sergeant then grabbed on top of Mr. Brooks's hand, and the two were fighting over the taser. So you can imagine this, it's kind of like the officer-involved shooting with Patrick Loyola, where the individual is on the ground, the police officer is, and they're on their stomach, the police officer is over them, and the two people are fighting over a taser. So in that situation, at some point during this struggle, the sergeant takes out his handgun and he shoots Mr. Brooks in the back while they are fighting over the taser. And obviously, there's a lot of controversy about this. When it comes to the case in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with Patrick Loyola, the police officer was actually charged with murder in that case. So it'll be interesting to see if that happens here. So a lot of these cases we're going to talk about today, it's not just the facts of the individual case that are interesting or that we want to report on, but a lot of these cases, they delve into deeper issues, and more questions should be asked because these cases touch on issues greater than just the individual fact pattern, but to broader issues in law enforcement and policing. And that's what we're really interested in getting at. So the question that we should all be asking before we even start to form an opinion on whether or not this was a lawful or a justified officer-involved shooting. But so Mr. Brooks, let's say he had control of the taser. Is that a situation where police officers would use deadly force? So let's dive into that a little bit. So in the police academy or in taser training, it is official training that all police officers get. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but all of the training that I have had with taser, this is what it said, is that if an individual has control of your taser or if an individual has a taser, that should be seen from a police officer's point of view as a deadly force situation. And here's why. It's not because of the 50,000 volt electric shock. That isn't it. In the police academy and in taser training, not all, but most police officers are tased in police training to get certified for a taser. When I went through, I was told that it was not optional, that you had to do it. It wasn't an option. I found out later on that no, it actually was optional and that a lot of officers carry tasers and they didn't get tased themselves. We weren't so lucky. We had to go through that, so again, if it's something that they are going to do to police officers in the police academy or in taser training, the 50,000 volt shock of riding the lightning for 5 seconds, that isn't what's deadly to a police officer. So I want to dispel that myth right there. What's deadly to a police officer is if someone is, here's how you would have to think about it. Here's how police officers do think about it. If someone is willing to take your taser from you and then use it against you, that police officer would be incapacitated for 5 seconds. One trigger pull would be 5 seconds of incapacitation. Now, once under incapacitated, it may not just be 5 seconds. If the more you pull the trigger, every time you pull the trigger, it could add another 5 seconds on. But let's call it 5 seconds, though it could absolutely be far longer than that if the prongs stay in place and stuff like that. But so once the police officer is incapacitated, the individual who is tasing them would have access to the police officer's gun, their baton, any other weapons. Maybe they don't have access to any weapons, but they could take their foot or their boot and they could smash in the officer's head. They could grab a rock. So really what you're asking for the police officers to do is say, this person just took my taser. There looks like they're going to use it against me, and I'm supposed to trust them that once I'm incapacitated, that they're not going to cave my head in with a rock. That's what you're asking police officers to do. So is that a reasonable thing to ask police officers? So if we think about it this way, that if a police officer has their taser taken from them and someone used the taser on police officers, it's reasonable that an officer would want to avoid that because the end result could very well be death. And if the end result is death for a police officer, you can be assured police officers are going to use deadly force in order to avoid that. Now, is that reasonable or not? So I'd like people's opinions that are in the chat, that are listening right now, to to see. So no, I'm not justifying any individual police shooting. I do that where I give opinions on whether I think things are justified or not. This case in particular, I'm not giving an opinion on whether or not I think it was lawful and justified. I think I need more information to make that determination. But what I just walked through with you with the whole taser situation, this is the kind of thing that needs to be thought about, and these are the questions that have to be asked. I think it's far too simple to say, well, the person was unarmed and he was under the police officer. It's not justified. Send the officer away for like Derek Chauvin for 22 years. I also think that it's not accurate to say, well, he's fighting with police officers, so sometimes that happens. So the extremes on either side, I don't think are the correct way to look at this. There is an middle position that I think most reasonable people fall in. And I think those are where the important questions should be asked. So I just wanted to bring that up. But like I said, in the Grand Rapids, Michigan, Patrick Loyola case, Officer Christopher Schur is charged, so it'll be interesting to see if this police officer is charged as well. I should note one other more training and tactical issue with this case is that after he shot Mr. Brooks, the officer also set his firearm down to where he wasn't holding the firearm anymore, and he was on the radio, calling for rescue and stuff like that. So I did just want to point that out, that 2 different times, both with the taser and with the handgun, after they were utilized, the officer set them down. Weapon retention is incredibly important for police officers because we want to make it so police officers should want to make it difficult for individuals that they are fighting with to actually grab a hold of any of their weapons. Let's see. So one question from I Spy. Thanks for the question. Was there any need for the officer to physically engage? See, that's a great question. That is the exact kind of questions that I like to answer. Okay, so let's think about it. So we're talking about lawful objective. What was the lawful objective that the police officers were trying to achieve? So what they knew at the time is that the individual, he shoplifted, which that's a misdemeanor, and then he had a battery, not felony, but some type of unwanted physical touching of the female employee. So 2 misdemeanor crimes. So communities and police departments can really tailor their policies onto how they want police officers to act in these situations. So what is the governmental interest of getting this individual into custody once someone has committed those crimes? So is it a policy that if someone runs from you, if it's a misdemeanor crime, you call it out and you try to set up a perimeter? Do the police department have a policy? If it's a misdemeanor, no, you do a foot chase and you call it out. So maybe there isn't a policy from that particular police department, and the officer just, if you see someone, you can make a reasonable decision in the moment. So those are all questions we have to ask. But, you want to start at the beginning. So should the officer have pursued him in the first place? Once the guy didn't listen, the officer tried to use a taser. Should the officer have tried to use the taser? Once the taser didn't work, what's the next reasonable thing to do? Should the officer have waited for backup? Well, he didn't. The officer went hands-on, and that's when things went downhill. So it's important to ask these questions every step of the way, and just think about it how use of force from police officers is supposed to be evaluated. What would a reasonable police officer do in the moment? Not 20/20 hindsight, but with the knowledge that the police officer had at the moment. All right. Minority Reporter, if you ever get in trouble, say your name's Hunter Biden. That's so funny. Thank you. Let's see. Let's see if we have any other questions about this particular case. Okay. All right. Okay. So I think we've kind of done that one enough. So Marco Polo has a comment about George Floyd. So there is some George Floyd news in the news this past week. So the sentences have come down for now the 3 other officers who happened to be with Derek Chauvin when Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd. So the first officer, we went over it last week, Thomas Lane, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in federal. So these are federal charges. So let me just say this really quick. So these police officers, they were charged for federal civil rights violations for what happened in George Floyd's death. And they were also charged in state court for state crimes. So we'll get into why that can happen here in a second and why isn't that double jeopardy. But so what we're talking about now is for federal civil rights violations. So Thomas Lane, he got 2.5 years in federal prison for his actions. Officer Quang, it's K-U-E-N-G, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but Officer Quang, he got 3 years in federal prison for his actions, and Officer Tao got 3.5 years in prison for his actions. So now let's just recap what they each did. So Officer Lane, the way this worked was Officer Chauvin was by George Floyd's head and neck area. Officer Lane was on the very end, so he was essentially holding George Floyd's feet. Officer Quang was in between. So Officer Lane, it's very reasonable that he didn't see what Derek Chauvin was. He was also a rookie officer at the time, but it's very possible that he didn't see what Derek Chauvin was doing. Despite that, 2 different times, he did, as a rookie officer, he asked Derek Chauvin, who is a 19-year veteran officer, he did ask 2 different times, hey, should we turn him over? Should we roll him over? And Derek Chauvin said no. But even though he did try to help George Floyd, and he was in a position where he probably couldn't see what was happening, he was given 2.5 years in federal prison. Officer Quang, K-U-E-N-G, who I think was probably the second most culpable, he was stabilizing and holding down George Floyd's back. So he didn't touch George Floyd's neck, but he was the closest. So if any one of the officers saw what George Floyd was doing, it would have been this officer. Now, this officer was a rookie, and Derek Chauvin did have 19 years on, but he is probably the most culpable of the 3, if any of them. And Officer Tao, he did have a couple years on. I want to say he had on between 5 to 6 years on. He was doing crowd control. So while this was going on, he never touched George Floyd. He was trying to hold back a crowd that was, reasonably infuriated and getting more infuriated by the moment. And it was reasonable for them to be mad at what was going on because of what Derek Chauvin was doing. But Officer Tao was dealing with a crowd of 10 to 15 people. So from his perspective, is it reasonable? So behind him, he has a 19-year veteran officer and 2 other cops. He's trying to hold back a crowd of 10 to 15 people and keep them at bay. Is it reasonable for him to not really be paying attention to what's going on behind him and to try to deal with an angry mob? I think that's pretty reasonable. So the fact that he got the second longest sentence of 3.5 years, that strikes me as strange and not just. I don't agree with that sentence. Also for Officer Lane, I don't agree with that sentence. The only one where I could kind of see the direction that the federal government was going with was Officer Quinn, who was right next to Derek Chauvin. So all of these officers, besides Derek Chauvin, are facing state charges of aiding and abetting second-degree murder, and that goes to trial in October. So a good question is, well, we have double jeopardy. You can't be charged for the same crime twice. So how are these officers charged in federal court and then in state court for essentially the same thing? So the way this works is that and if you ever listen to Mark Garagos, who does a podcast with Adam Carolla called Reasonable Doubt, which is great, for 15, 10, 20 years, Mark Garagos has been complaining about this exact thing. And essentially what the argument against it is, well, let me tell you what it is first. So essentially it's you cannot be charged with the same crime or prosecuted for the same crime in the same jurisdiction. So the way they get around this here is, okay, this happened in Minnesota, so we're going to charge you in Minnesota court, but we're also going to charge you in federal court because what you did violates federal laws. So that's how one incident could get someone charged with state charges and federal charges, and it not be double jeopardy because you're charged in technically 2 different jurisdictions. A lot of time when this comes up is with like white collar crime, where someone will commit fraud and embezzlement, and there'll also be some other type of wiretapping or fraud or wiretapping or money laundering on the federal side. And those are the types of cases that usually this is in reference to is higher level financial crimes or other violent crimes that cross state lines where people can charge both in the federal system and in the state system. So Mark Garagos and other defense attorneys have argued against this for a long time. He says it's ridiculous. If someone commits a crime, pick one. Charge them in federal, charge them on the state level. But that is what happens. And oftentimes police officers, because the government is the entity that has the ability to violate civil rights, a lot of the time police officers are also police officer also charged in this manner. And Minority Report run the time concurrently. Yeah, and a lot of times that's what happens. So I think Derek Chauvin got 22 years in state court, and then I think in federal court he got somewhere around that as well. They're not going to stack on top of each other. They're going to serve them at the same time. But legal experts that I've listened to think that, well, because we know what the federal time limit is, or the federal sentences are for these officers, that it's reasonable to expect that they'll do plea deals on the state level for probably around the same amount of time. This would avoid trials, which maybe they wouldn't get that much more time anyways, and that they would just serve whatever time is on the federal level, which, you know, is in the range of between 2.5 and 3.5 years. So I know that I covered this last time, and also on some of the content I do on Police Law News, I covered this, and a lot of people have questions about, you know, whether or not Derek Chauvin actually killed George Floyd. So I've said a lot of things about this, but I just want to make it clear. What Derek Chauvin, yes, George Floyd had a lethal dose of fentanyl in his system. He had COVID, he had heart problems. So there were other things going on with George Floyd, but what Derek Chauvin did is clearly excessive force. He utilized force on someone who was, at this point, he was in handcuffs. 2 other officers were holding him down. So what Derek Chauvin did is he used force in a way that was excessive. It's difficult to argue that. The force isn't reasonable, it was excessive. Did Derek Chauvin try to kill George Floyd? Did he wake up in the morning and say he was going to kill someone? Well, no. No, he didn't. Of course not. But he used excessive force. While using that excessive force, someone died. That's what happened. Yes, there were other factors, but I think it's important to know that that's what basically came out in the trial and per the autopsy. So it's reasonable that he is in prison for 22 years or so. The next case that I want to talk about is, well, let's see if there's any comments on that. Ray Baker, he held the force for too long, and that's why he was convicted. Yeah, that's exactly correct. So had Derek Chauvin put the knee on the neck for a second or two and realized, oh, this isn't okay, we don't have to do this, and he just took his knee off the neck, same position, stood there, no, he wouldn't have been prosecuted, and he because no one would have died. So yeah, Maddox Perez says it's second-degree murder. Exactly. So you know, I think he was convicted of is something to the effect, in Minnesota, I think it's called like unintentional murder, because he wasn't trying to kill him, but it was excessive force. So he was essentially, you know, what the court found is that he was trying to hurt him by using the excessive force, and during that, someone died. And yeah, when that happens, people should be punished because there was a specific intent to do something excessive. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't like Kim Potter, who did something on accident where the intent wasn't there. Like Derek Chauvin had intent to harm. Didn't have intent to kill, but had intent to harm. And while he was harming, he killed someone. So again, I do not have any reservations about saying that Derek Chauvin doing over 20 years is a reasonable thing. A Minority Report, he worked security with Floyd, had beef with him. Yeah, so that's that did come out before the trial. In the actual trial, there was no evidence to that. So either side didn't think if that happened, either side did not think it was advantageous to bring up because nobody did. All right, so the next case that I want to talk about, so this happened on July 16th in San Bernardino, California, and this is kind of a strange one. So the individual, this was an officer-involved shooting where someone died. His name was Robert Adams. So this is what happened. It's a little bit strange, and there is surveillance video on this, and there's also body cam footage, but the surveillance video doesn't have audio, and the body cam footage doesn't have audio either until after the officer-involved shooting. But let me just walk you through what happened with this case. So police, what they're saying is that police officers got a call. All right, we have a super chat from Elizabeth Williams. Thank you so much. So Elizabeth Williams says, "Love listening to the legal breakdowns." Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That is so nice. And if you or if anyone else has any particular cases, because there's so much news this week, we couldn't get to anything. But here's as the Cop Watch staff, we kind of went through and thought these would be the most interesting cases. But if you do have any cases that you would really like to hear something about, put it in the comments or in the chat, and we'll definitely try to get those covered for next week. So Elizabeth Williams, thank you again. All right, so back to Robert Adams. So again, this is a case where the officers get a call for service, where it's a parking lot, it's during the day, and the call is that there is an armed man who's kind of walking around the parking lot. So that's the call for service that gets. Who responds to that call are undercover officers. Well, I don't know if they're undercover, but they're in an undercover car. So they're not in a marked police car. They're in uniform, but in an unmarked car. So it's reasonable to think that Robert Adams, as the unmarked car pulls into the parking lot, that at least at first, he doesn't know this is police officers. Like, it's reasonable to think that. So as the unmarked four-door sedan pulls up into the parking lot, Robert Adams, the surveillance video shows this, walk towards the car. As he walks towards the car, there's a firearm that is in his waistband that is visible. And as he walks towards the police officers, he pulls out the firearm. So from his point of view, what his family is saying, that he thought that he was about to be the victim of a drive-by shooting or of some other crime because this car just pulled up on him. Now, if I'm standing in a parking lot and a car pulls into that parking lot, my first thought might not be this random car that pulled up is here to do a drive-by shooting on me, because I'm in parking lots all the time where I don't think that and pull out my gun. But this is what the family is saying. So this makes me think that, okay, there's something else going on. If you're in a parking lot and if a car pulls up and your first thought is, I'm going to get shot, a drive-by shooting, you should be at least thinking, okay, maybe there's something more going on than he's just a random person who's going about his day standing in a parking lot. So that's just asking questions that I think a reasonable person would want to know. But anyway, so he walks towards the unmarked car. And when he does so, he pulls out the firearm. Doesn't point it, but he pulls it out. Police officers at that point jump out of the car and start to chase him. As soon as they jump out of the car, Robert Adams starts running in the other direction towards a building and towards other parked vehicles. So the body camera from the police officers, unfortunately, doesn't start until after the officer-involved shooting. So it would be nice to see this, and obviously there's no audio when it comes to surveillance. But what the chief is saying, that the police officer said, is that as they exited, they identified themselves as police officers and gave commands such as, stop, drop the gun, show us your hands. So as Mr. Adams is running away from police officers, and the surveillance camera, it's really hard to see, but from the police department, what they are saying happened is that he started to turn towards police officers, and it was at that point that police officers killed him. Shot and killed him. I believe it was within just about under 10 seconds from pulling up on scene. So again, the question of whether or not this was lawful or justified, I don't think any of us should be there right now. I think we should all have serious questions about it, and I think there's a lot more information that needs to come out about whether this was a lawful or a justified shooting, because serious people should be asking questions just like that. So here are the questions that I want to know. So when a call for service like this comes out, is it best practices to send officers who are in an unmarked vehicle? Because it's reasonable to say that at first, Mr. Adams didn't know that they were police officers. Once they jumped out of the car and started chasing him, did he know they were police officers? Yes, they were in uniform, but all he knows is that a car pulls up and two individuals start to jump out. As soon as the doors flew open, did he turn around and not see who it is? Did the police officers, that's why body cameras are so important. They protect police officers more than anything, because they're claiming that they yelled police and other commands, but it's not on video. So there's no proof that they did that, which would be unbelievable and great to have from the side of police officers, because if they did that, that would be the correct thing to do. But we all wish that there was proof one way or another if they did it or not. So, from Mr. Brooks, did he turn around and start running before he even saw it was police? Once he's running, and I always talk about in stressful situations how police officers are regular humans. They're regular people. They're not superhuman. So in stressful situations, you get tunnel vision. You don't always hear things. Time slows down. Well, listen, that isn't just true for police officers. It's true for regular people, for civilians too. So from the point of view of Mr. Adams, as soon as the doors fly open and he starts to run away, even if they yelled police, Did he know they were police? Did he hear it? Did he have the same tunnel vision, the same issues with time that when you're under great stress that police officers have? So if we're going to give that to police officers, or not even give that, but just state, hey, this is something that happens to the human body under stress, then I think a reasonable and fair person has to say, hey, this can also happen to other people. This could have happened to Mr. Adams. So now from the police officer's perspective, they get a call for service of a man with a gun. They arrive on scene. As soon as they get there, dude with a gun, visible gun in a waistband. Now, a lot of us carry firearms off duty or just have concealed carry permits. You never see the gun. It's concealed. No one ever sees it. But Mr. Adams was carrying a gun in a way that you could see it. He then pulled it out and started walking towards the police officers. So from the point of view of police officers, like, this isn't just a regular concealed carry holder because you can see it. And this is in California. I don't even know if there is concealed carry in Florida, but I'm just saying in general, it's not someone who's just walking around, Mr. Adams was trying to let people know that he had a firearm. It was visible from his waistband, and then he pulls it out and he's holding it as the police officers rolled up. So from the perspective of the police officers, they arrive on scene. Someone who's obviously armed with a gun starts walking towards them and pulls out the gun. Now, they have a couple options there. They can either drive away and, risk not engaging, but are they going to be shot at as they drive away? Or they can engage. Well, in the moment, they engaged. They're saying that they jumped out of the car and they yelled police. Now, when someone is running away and they have a gun in their hand, it takes less than half a second for them to turn around, or not even their whole body, to start firing weapons. So it's important to know that from the point of view of police officers, if you have a gun and if you make any kind of movement, like you're turning around or going to shoot the police officer, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's always justified, but I promise you, most police officers in that situation are going to assume that the gun that you are holding, you're going to use it against the police officer. So if the goal in a lot of this is to make it so there are less officer-involved shootings, it's important to let people know, hey, in this type of situation, this is what police officers think. I'm not saying it's always justified or always lawful, but this is what police officers think. And the reason is because when you're running from someone, it's to be able to shoot someone behind you can happen in a quarter of a second, half a second. It's so fast, and you're putting police officers in a position where they have to make less than a split-second decision on whether or not they're going to allow someone to shoot them. Because once you allow someone to start shooting, you've already been shot. So you have to keep that in mind. So that's an interesting question. Now, the attorney from Mr. Adams' family said that the police officers that they were wrong in this case, and that Mr. Adams thought that he was going to be the victim of a drive-by, and that's why he took those actions. So why he ran from the police, the attorney didn't say that. Ray Baker says tunnel vision is a real thing. Don't discount it. Definitely not discounting it, Mr. Baker. I talk about it all the time. That in stressful situations, this is what the human body does. I took Force Science not that long ago, which is an unbelievable course which covers a lot of these things and goes through a lot of the research and not only personal experience, but going through the training where you see some of the studies and the research behind it. Tunnel vision is a real thing when people are in stressful situations. Also, time slows down. Also, you don't always hear things. Sometimes, one sense is all you get. You can see things, but it's slower, and it's a strange thing. But again, we have to acknowledge that this doesn't happen just to police. It could happen to anybody who is under stressful situations. Let's see. Let's see if we have any. We have a couple comments. Jennifer says the family argument is a joke. How about not approaching a vehicle with a gun in your hand? Yeah, and that's a reasonable. So I appreciate the comment, Jennifer. So the question to ask is, why did Mr. Adams approach a vehicle in this manner? So his attorney said that he thought that he was going to be the victim of a drive-by shooting. So let's talk about attorneys really quick here. So when attorneys are representing a family after an officer-involved shooting or after an incident with police, I wouldn't trust what they said as being true. Now, they very well may be representing their clients and doing a really good job for their clients, but they have no interest in saying things that are true. Now, they can't outright lie, So they can't outright lie, but they have no interest. It would be opposite interest of their client to be 100% honest. So just because the attorney representing the family says something doesn't mean that it's true or reasonable. So I just want to put that out there, though I think people kind of already know that's the case. So any other, any other comments about that have good questions or reasonable? Okay. All right, let's see. And okay, so like I said, we have a couple more cases to go over here, but this week there were so many cases and issues with police officers that happened that were interesting. So I really want to put it out there that definitely add comments to this video about what cases you would like to see for next week, because we don't always just cover the case that happened this week. If there was something that really interesting happened the last couple days that we missed, we definitely want to get it covered. So definitely add comments, give us suggestions on cases to cover, because we want to put out content and go over cases of really interesting issues and incidents of police interactions with the public. So definitely let us know. So we've talked about this next one before. It's not really a case. It's a law. It's an Arizona law that essentially prohibits people, or it puts restrictions on people filming police in public. So here's what the law is in Arizona, is that you cannot film police officers within 8 feet unless the police officer gives you permission to do so. This is in reference to, the sponsor of the bill, he's a representative named Kavanaugh from Arizona. He was a police officer for 20 years, retired, then he's a Republican in the state's legislature in Arizona. And the purpose behind this bill, what he says, the purpose behind this bill is to make it so when police officers are working, on a call for service or on a traffic stop, the concern is that cop watchers and auditors and anyone else, but typically those two groups, that's who he mentioned, would come up to police officers and interfere with what they're doing. Now, interference with a police officer is already a crime, but they would come up pretty close to police officers and put cameras in the police officers' faces while the officers are trying to do their jobs. Now, again, just like with most things, I think that there's a reasonable alt-middle position that a lot of us could get into. So I think that if a police officer is engaged in the use of force, if they are interviewing a domestic violence victim, if they are doing a lot of different things, someone who isn't involved in the call coming within 2 feet of a police officer with a camera, I think most of us can say, yeah, that's probably not reasonable. Also, on the other hand, saying someone has to stay 50 feet away from police while they're doing it, well, that's probably not reasonable either. So the state of Arizona came up with, in the state legislature passed 8-foot rule, unless the police officer gives you permission, that you cannot, film a police officer. And the goal of this, at least what they're saying, is that it's not to stop people from filming. No, just go 8.5 feet away and you can film all you want. Now, the question that always gets asked, so I'm going to address it because either people are thinking it or they're going to ask it, is, well, so what if you're the one who's subject of police? So what if I'm on a traffic stop, I'm driving a car, or what if a police officer comes up to talk to me? What if I'm filming? So I would have to turn off my camera? Like, when it comes to transparency, like, that seems a little shady. So there's an exception in the law for that. So if you are the direct subject of the police interaction, if you are the person that the police officers approach, if you are the driver in a traffic stop, there's an exception for that. This law does not apply to you. So at first, when this law was going through the House, this wasn't a part of it. This wasn't a part of it. And what the writer of the bill, Kavanaugh, what he said is, he said, you know what? I didn't even think of that. Like it didn't even, I was only thinking about it of other people coming into the situation of filming. It didn't even occur to me that, yeah, the way this bill is originally written, it would prevent people on traffic stops who cops are directly interacting with from recording. He said that's not the intent. So the final version of the bill actually took that reasonable criticism into account and added in that exception. So what comments do people or questions do people have about that? Good idea or bad idea? And it is important to say that it's interfering with police. So what the opposition says is, hey, interfering with police during an investigation, that's already a crime. So if someone is doing something, no matter what it is, and it rises to the level of interference, like that's already illegal. We don't need this extra law. So that's what a lot of people on the other side of it say, is that it's just an unnecessary law, and that if we're going to err, we should err on the side of the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. So that's from the other side. But from a practical level, like not thinking about, for this moment, not thinking about like the other constitutional implications, just from a reasonable level, is it reasonable to say that you have to stay 8 feet away from a police officer? Yeah, I mean, that's probably fine. Could it be 6 feet? Could it be 10 feet? Sure. I think we all agree 50 feet is too far, 2 feet is too close, 8 feet, I think I'm fine with that. America First is the question, what about cops who shut off their cameras? And I got a good story about that. So what about cops who shut off their cameras? Well, I mean, so we have to think. That's a good question. Is it policy? So police departments have policy on when they have to run their cameras. So as long as it's not a violation of policy, you know, I don't think anyone or most people shouldn't have an issue of police officers turning off their cameras. When police shouldn't turn off their cameras is when they're trying to hide something, or when it looks strange, or when it looks, you know, kind of shady, I guess. So that's what I think about police officers turning off their cameras. If police officers are on a call and they have to use the bathroom, yeah, they should turn it off when they go to the bathroom. If police officers are on a call for service and there's, you know, they're trying to come up with a force array, or they're trying to come up with tactics to take someone into custody, yeah, while they are briefing and coming up with the plan on how to, you know, best get someone into custody, that conversation, yeah, I don't think that should be recorded. Now, as soon as they say, okay, we're going to walk down the street, try to contact this individual, yes, turn the camera on now. So what I see a lot of the time is police officer, it'll be a situation like America First, I Spy agree. So a lot of situations, what happens is the police officers will have their cameras off for what most of us think is a reasonable reason. 3 or 4 police officers are trying to come up with a plan to take someone into custody. And while they're trying to come up with that plan, the individual comes out of the house, starts shooting at them. So essentially, the situation happens faster than they're expecting. And then in that moment, you know, while they're being shot at, they just respond directly to the threat and forget to turn their cameras off. So that isn't a situation where it would be bad faith on police officers, because they're doing something, yeah, we get why they don't have their cameras on now, and then something happens quickly. So not all the time, but a lot of the time when police officers don't have their cameras on, it's a situation like that, is they weren't expecting anything to happen at that moment, something happened quickly. And instead of in their brain thinking, oh my God, turn on my camera, they think, oh my God, someone's shooting at me, and they just respond directly and then turn their camera on later on. So that's a lot of things police officers can do, you know, before you get to a call for service. Just have a habit of turning on the camera before you exit the vehicle. There's things like that, and there's things in policy in different departments that kind of do that. Bike and its boy, cops who shut their cameras off or mute them should be charged with destruction of evidence. So I mean, that's an interesting point. So again, I think it's well, what situation is it? You know, why did they turn it off? Why did they mute it? And I'm going to tell a story here really quick. So you all remember the story from Sunrise, Florida, Sergeant Police, Pullease. There was a call for service back probably about 7 months ago or so in Sunrise, Florida. And what happened was, just a quick story on this as a side note, what happened was, and it's been all over the news lately because he just got charged, which is a good thing. So there's an individual, he committed a violent felony. He's not getting into the police car. He's kind of giving officers a hard time. Sergeant Police, he arrives on scene. Just as the guy's getting in the car, he kind of leans into the car. He says some rude things. He screams at the guy. He threatens to utilize force. When the guy's already in the car, and a female officer who's, you know, half the size of this guy, a third of the size of this guy, she sees him screaming at this guy, like inside the police car, screaming at him, and she pulls him from his belt to get him away. Now that is unbelievable courage from that police officer to do that, even though the person was a supervisor. So she not only had the knowledge in the moment to say, hey, he's making a bad decision. She knew that pulling him away was going to be controversial and unpopular, but she had the integrity to do it anyways. So she pulls the sergeant away. He immediately turns around, pushes her, pushes her back by the throat, and then screams at her, "I'll see you in 5 minutes." Now I'm getting to the camera issue because what they didn't show initially, which at least maybe they did, I just saw it this week, is then he goes back and he yells at the guy in the car one more time. He has to get one more screaming match in with the guy in the car. Then he tells all of the officers on scenes, he says, "Shut off your fucking cameras now." So a situation like that, yeah, I can't remember who commented, 100%. That is the kind of situation that, yeah, that looks bad. So in a situation like that, police officers should not be turning off their cameras, and supervisors absolutely should not be ordering people to turn off their cameras, because we can guess what that conversation was. Like after he did that to the female officer, we can guess what that conversation was, but that is a situation where turning off a camera. And just to kind of close that loop, Sergeant Police, so since this happened, he was put on admin leave. They investigated. He was just charged with 4 charges, felony charges, including battery and assault on a police officer, which is a good thing that he's charged. And I just want to commend that female officer who did something tough in the moment, and she made the right decision. She should be commended for that. I Spy, he lost his job, didn't he? So he was on admin leave, and he was just charged with crimes. So my guess, and I didn't see this, but most of the time when police officers are charged with crimes, it's at that point that they're either terminated or they resign. So I don't know if he's officially gone from the department, but he has been on administrative leave since this happened, and he has been charged. So if he hasn't lost his job yet, that's coming. Let's see, one more question. Maddox Prowlers, how about cops who sue citizens? Well, that's actually interesting. That's happened a lot of times. It's actually hard for a police officer to do because, you know, in order to sue someone civilly, there's an exception in there for first responders, for police, fire, and medics. So long story short is when you take those jobs, there is an acceptable level of risk that you know you're taking as part of that job. So in order to sue a citizen, let's say there's a battery against a police officer. In order to go and sue that person, it would have to be pretty egregious. Different states have different laws on that. I know it has happened. What I've seen be successful recently is when someone files a false complaint on a police officer, kind of like defamation of character, and by body camera footage, police are able to show that it's false. I've seen some civil suits recently be successful in that area, which I think that is a great thing. If you file a false report against a police officer and the police officer could have really suffered some damage from that, yeah, I have no problem with them suing you personally. But I also feel the same way about any other citizen, because I think that defamation laws are good. So, you know, it's kind of like defamation of character. You just have to think about it that way. So the last case that I want to talk about is Paul Chavez in Modesto, California. So this happened on 7/14 of 22. I just saw this case today. I actually just did a longer story about it on my channel, Police Law News. But essentially what happened with Paul Chavez is the family called in, his father-in-law called in and said that he was drunk and that he was causing a disturbance and that he was ripping off the screen of the house and he was trying to get into the house. So police were called, police arrived on scene, officers got there, so Mr. Chavez is in the front yard, doesn't have a shirt on, he's intoxicated, and he's holding a tow hitch. So, you know, just think it's kind of like, you know, like a metal blunt object. He's holding a tow hitch in his hand. Police officers contact him. They give him commands to drop it. He starts walking towards the police officers, and they try to tase him. This is a theme today. They try to tase him. The taser doesn't work. They give him more commands to drop the tow hitch. He doesn't. He takes a couple steps towards police officers, and they shoot him and they kill him. Jeremiah Osborne says was a totally unjustified shooting. Yeah, and a lot of people think that. And again, because I just saw this case today, so this is one of the, like with most cases, to say that it's justified or unjustified just based on only doing a little bit of research. So I know the facts of the case and I did research, but you know, without really knowing all of the facts and all of the information, you know, I'm not comfortable saying that this was a justified or unjustified officer-involved shooting. But what I do is ask important questions that I would want answered to be able to determine whether or not it was justified or not. But so we have a couple things. So Jeremiah Osborne, you said this was an unjustified shooting, and it might be, but I'm going to push back on that a little bit. So you have a police officer who tried to tase him, it didn't work. So the criticism from police is that they should have tried to tase him again. Why just try to tase him once? Try to tase him again. So that's a reasonable question. That's a question that I would want answered when making a determination. So the police officers didn't try to tase him again. They went to lethal force. Now, he was walking towards the police officers with a blunt object in his hand. So from the perspective of police officers, someone has a blunt object. You know that they're upset. They're not listening to you. They're walking towards you with it. It's reasonable for a police officer to think whatever they have in their hand, they're going to try to use it against me. Well, a tow hitch, a blunt object, can cave someone's skull in. So from the distance the police officers were to Paul Chavez, how quickly could he have gotten to the police officers? Probably in a second and a half. So now another question, maybe the police officers should have backed up. But you have to think about it this way. So once police are there, and they were there not just because they were driving around bored and they saw someone in their driveway. No, the family called in and said, hey, this guy is out of control. He's dangerous. He's trying to get into the house. We can't handle him. We need armed agents of the government to solve this problem for us. Okay, so when you get there, you have to think about it this way. So if the police officers back up too much or get in their cars and leave or go down the block, well, now you're leaving someone who the family who has an interest of, in his favor, has already said they can't handle him. So what if police officers back up and do a Uvalde where they don't do anything? And while they're backed up, 100, 200 feet down where they're trying to get more resources, he breaks into the house. He breaks into the house through a window or through a door. And then he kills the people inside or he injures someone inside. We would be saying, oh, look at the police officers. They got there. They knew that this family couldn't handle this guy, but they were afraid. They were afraid that they were going to be struck with a tow hitch. So yeah, they have the guns, but they went down 150 feet, 200 feet away to call for more resources. And they just let these people be bludgeoned to death. These people called for police for help and the police officers backed up. So what I'm just saying is that if police officers did that and the worst happened, this is the criticism that the police officers would get. So I'm not saying that this is a justified officer-involved shooting, but just remember, if the police officers take a different action and this goes a different way, the criticism of police officers is going to be pretty extreme in the opposite direction. The last thing I'm going to say about this case is an issue I touched on earlier. It's the dishonesty of attorneys. Let's go in general, and I have a law degree, so I feel comfortable saying this, though I don't think anyone feels uncomfortable talking shit about attorneys, but it's the dishonesty from the attorneys in general and also from attorneys who represent these families. So what the attorneys did, the attorneys were able to see the body cam footage before the public. So what the attorney and the family representative did is, whether or not you think it's an justified shooting or not, they started the video that they played for the media 2 seconds before the shooting started. So they show the officers yelling at him for 2 seconds and then shooting him. So they don't show that the officers arrived on scene, that they tried to talk to him, that they tried to use a less lethal option by using a taser. They only show 2 seconds before and the shooting. So this is intentional. This is intentional and it's dishonest because they're trying to spin a narrative. Now that narrative for that attorney representing the family, it benefits the family. So as an attorney, like, the lawyering is good. I completely understand. If this were a law school class, I would be saying, yes, the lawyering is good. I get it. But when it comes to the rest of us in regular society who are concerned about serious issues and honesty and truth and looking at these cases and really trying to figure out what happened, this is extremely dishonest because they're trying to put out a narrative to uneducated and uninformed activists. And it's the job here of me and at Cop Watch, one of the things that we like to do is to not just show a narrative, is to show an entire incident, the raw footage of exactly what the interaction was between police officers. Here's the 911 call. Here's 2 body cam videos. Here's surveillance video. And you guys decide. That might make police officers look great. That might make police officers look like shit, like they committed a crime. And that doesn't matter. How anybody looks, whether it makes the police officers look bad or the public look bad, that doesn't matter. What matters is how honest and accurate is the information that we're providing. And that's what we're interested in here at Cop Watch. That is not what attorneys who represent these families are interested in. And again, They shouldn't be interested in that because they are trying to serve the interests of their client. One more thing, also on the news for this particular case, there was a family member who went on the news and gave a statement who said that when police shot Mr. Chavez, that he had nothing in his hands, his arms are open, and the guy even went like this. So that was on the news. How many people are going to see that news clip from a family member? Like I said, whether you think it's justified or not, saying that he had nothing in his hands is not accurate and it's not honest. But how many people are going to see that clip and just automatically say, oh, the police shot another unarmed person? So that's why I think it is so important to be accurate and honest, and whether or not you say it's justified or not, to ask tough and important questions and to try to think of things from the perspective of this is what the individual is probably thinking and this is what the police officers are probably thinking. Because if one of the goals of all of this is so that there are less officer-involved shootings, so that less individuals are hurt and killed by police, and also that less police officers are killed. And Jeremiah Osborne, I think you're the one who said that it was not justified. They were on scene for less than 60 seconds. True, absolutely. They were on scene for less than 60 seconds, correct. So I'm criticizing the honesty of the attorney for not playing the whole 60-second video, for only playing 2 seconds before the shooting, to purposely not show the officers try to use and try to end this with less lethal options of a taser. So that was the last case I have. I'm going to wrap this up real quick, but any questions or comments that I haven't got to, definitely go ahead and put it in. And the last thing I'm going to say is we covered tasers a lot. So for 50 years, I'm making that number up, it could be 100 years, I don't know, police officers and police departments have been trying to find a weapon in between a baton and a gun. And all of the weapon systems that they've come up with have been imperfect. I remember being in my first year undergraduate school and in criminal justice classes, and Dr. Cronkite, who was he was one of my instructors. He was a commander with LAPD in the 90s. He went on to be the Santa Ana, California police chief. I remember him, we did a whole day on these intermediate weapons, these weapon systems, where he showed videos of these different things. There was this video of this system where it's like a net that you would shoot at people, this thing that had like foam that would freeze people in foam, all these different things that police departments have tried to come up with, because you can imagine a situation that there's a lot of situations that happen in between where a baton would be appropriate and where a gun would be appropriate. And the taser, this was true in 2005 when I was in class, and it's true now. The taser, and if I'm incorrect, put it in the comments. If there's something I don't know about, put it in there, please. But the taser is the best thing that police officers have. That being the case, ACM Reports, which does research on this, ACM Reports found in, I believe, 2019, that tasers fail 40% of the time. So the best thing police officers have in between a baton and a gun fails 40% of the time. Sometimes it's operator error. Sometimes it's difficult to hit a moving target with a taser. Sometimes police officers probably only train with tasers a couple times a year, and as opposed to hundreds of shots a year that they practice on the range. One last question. Elizabeth, thank you. What are your thoughts on arrested Congress members? So let's see what were, so that's a great question, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. So arrested Congress members. So this happens a lot, so I'm not sure what you're talking about. So I'm not sure what you're talking about. So if you want to tell me who you are, let me know. But you might be talking about members of the squad, AOC, Ilhan Omar. They were arrested, Rashida Tlaib. They were arrested this past week. And essentially what happened was they were part of a protest that, police officers in D.C. had everybody moved. They were asked to leave. And they were essentially escorted by police officers. Now, as they were escorted by police officers, they all put their hands behind their backs. They weren't handcuffed, but they put their hands behind their back. So the criticism is that they pretended to be arrested. And the first news reports were that they were arrested, and that they did this just to have an image and the perception that they were arrested. Look at how much we care about these causes. We're willing to go to jail. They weren't arrested. They were just escorted from the area by police officers. No one was in handcuffs. No one was charged with a crime. No one went to jail. So the criticism was that they did this for show, that this is all just a game. This is for show. It didn't really happen. They were questioned about it. And the only answer I saw was from AOC. And AOC, I don't always believe the things she says are the reasonable, but her answer that she must have had some coaching on this, was actually kind of reasonable. She said that when you're being escorted and asked to leave by police officers, the safest thing to do is to put your hands behind your back like that. So whether or not that's what she was thinking in the moment, I don't know, but is what she said factual and true? Yeah, probably. That's gonna be it for today's show. So make sure that you go ahead and like and subscribe to Cop Watch. And everybody, have a great weekend.